It's up.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Library of Mistakes. My name is Russell Napier. I'm the keeper of the Library of Mistakes, and welcome back. This is week 3, third evening in a beautiful Scottish summer. And we're delighted that you could all make it. We're here to discuss this great new book by Robbie Mochrie, sitting beside me. I'll introduce Robbie in a minute. Somewhere in Edinburgh, there's a big box of these books, but they're not here. So if you would like to speak to Lauren afterwards, you can pre-order your book, and next time you come, it'll be sitting here waiting for you, and we will eventually have those books available for you. So, and she might find other ways of getting you those books as well. So please have a chat to Lauren. I've known Robbie for a long time, senior lecturer in economics at Heriot-Watt University. This library has got a link to Heriot-Watt University because our course, The Practical History of Financial Markets, runs at Heriot-Watt and is running there now for 21 years. So 21 years we've been teaching investment professionals about mistakes. And as you can see from the outcome, we've made a great job of it. Give us another 20 years and who knows what might be possible. So Robbie's here to talk about this tremendous book. It's called How to Think Like an Economist. It's also, I think, a brief history of economic thought, which links it together. It's a real driving narrative. It's quite an achievement. And I never thought I'd say this, a book about economics. It's a bit of a page-turner. So Robbie will present on the book. I'll ask him a few questions. You get to ask him a few questions. And then we all get to drink. Robbie, over to you.
Okay, right. Well, so thank you. First of all, thank you very much, Russell. A very kind introduction, much as I expected. And it's a real pleasure to be here and to talk to my book, talk about this book in front of an audience which I know will be both knowledgeable and enthusiastic. Quite recently, a colleague pointed out to me that people come here out of interest, and that helps to lift the level of the discussion amongst the above the pointed academic pedantry, to which I'm more used. So when I come here, in fact, I expect to take part in deep, complex, challenging discussions, and that's especially the case if I'm meeting Patrick Skotanis and his Market Mind group. You'll find Patrick's book, The Market Mind Hypothesis, facing you at the corner there. And well, I wouldn't expect you to be able to read it as quickly as you can read mine. I'll put it that way. So what I've done is to write a little book. It's got the title, as Russell said, How to Think Like an Economist. And I'm going to say the title is the first mistake. Not just, as I suggested in the publicity for the meeting, because there are many ways to think about the economy, but because it wasn't actually my purpose to do that. Explaining the title will then lead naturally, I think, into two other mistakes. The first one is thinking about who we should actually count as economists. And I'm going to argue that we're all economists, not just a few people. Economists aren't just a few people who become specialists in thinking about the economy. And then mirroring that mistake, the idea that all economists must be professionally trained, those professionals, of whom I suppose I am actually one, sometimes fall into the error of thinking that their discipline is completely autonomous and that they only need to talk with each other. So what I'm going to do is run through these three mistakes quickly, and then I want to concentrate on what I've actually called it an error rather than a mistake, and it's a possible error. And this is where I'm going to try and be a little bit provocative. Is it a mistake to think of John Maynard Keynes as an economist? In my book, when you get to the chapter on Keynes, and I hope you all will get as far as that anyway, I call him the last amateur. Was I right, I'm going to ask, to treat this complex man and consummate networker as an economist, or would it have been better for me to treat him as the most perceptive critic of economics ever? Now, let me turn to my talk itself. So this book is the third in a series called How to Think, and we've already had How to Think Politically and How to Think Like a Philosopher. We now have, of course, How to Think Like an Economist. So politics, philosophy, and economics. That's the title of the Oxford degree chosen by many of our aspiring leaders. And I would have to say that from what I can see of most of them, they dump the E as quickly as possible. But if you read the book, I hope that what you're going to find is that it's impossible to disentangle those three elements. There's unity to politics, philosophy, and economics. And what I think you're going to find out as well, or I hope you'll find out as well, is that most great economists have had to think about all of these. So there's a sense in which, with these three books, Bloomsbury actually has a rather nice set. Now, how I came to write the book, a little more than 2 years ago, Jamie Marshall, who is a literary agent, he'd signed me up several years before, even before I had a good idea for a book. He called me up to say he was in Edinburgh, he wanted to meet me for a drink, and he had an idea. Well, Jamie does his business with a whole load of hospitality, so over more than one drink, we thrashed out an outline for the book proposal. And turning those ideas into a detailed proposal was fairly straightforward, except when the publisher looked at the contents page and suggested there weren't enough women. My answer to that was, we're talking about economics. We're talking about the history of economics. Until Claudia Goldin was honoured last October, as many Scots men as women across the world had won the Nobel Memorial Prize. The team at Bloomsbury therefore readily accepted my proposal that I would show the importance of women in shaping discussions about economics for which men got the credit. That finally allowed me to write the book which I had envisaged as soon as the idea was suggested. And just as many novels first novels end up being autobiographical, this, my first trade book, is deeply personal. Almost entirely what I've been doing is to write about the people who have influenced my thinking about the economy. So this book, and this is the mistake, it's not how to think like an economist. It's much more of a discussion, after 40 years of practice, how I've come to think about the economy. It's how to think like Robbie Mochrie. Told through biographical sketches in which I do emphasise how great thinkers have approached economic analysis. Now, it was very easy, for example, for me, we're in Edinburgh, I have to mention Adam Smith, so it was very easy for me to show that The Wealth of Nations was a product of its time, as were John Maynard Keynes's general theory, and indeed Milton Friedman's Monetary History of the United States. Those three great thinkers, and I would say that they are primarily responsible for our understanding of the modern economy, firmly placed their economic analysis in the context of the societies in which they lived. You can't read them simply as books about the economy in abstract. They are books about Scotland during the First Industrial Revolution. They are books about the world during the Great Depression. And then Milton Friedman's history is actually a book which is essentially saying, well, you've taken Keynes too literally. Think more carefully about what he had to say. I think the same kind of thing can be said of Karl Marx, who took the political economy of Adam Smith and David Ricardo and argued that they had only scraped the surface of the economy in their work. But in placing what he could observe of the economy in the mid-19th century into the vast sweep of philosophically complex theories, Marx used the methods of classical political economy, the methods of the time, the philosophy of the time, the forms of argument of his time. Das Kapital is dripping with romanticism. It's dripping with the theology of the 19th century, the millenarian theology of the 19th century as well. So what I'm going to argue is that thinking like an economist actually means looking at the world in a very particular way. It means trying to understand how it is at that time. And this is the last sentence, the last part of the words of my foreword, it means thinking about how to change the world for the better. We're not just here to understand the world, we're here to change it. And so, going back to classical Athens, which is the starting point for how to think like a philosopher, how to think politically, and now how to think like an economist, what we've got is economics beginning as a very minor field of philosophy, literally household management, at a time, though, when the household was largely self-sufficient. Why? Because Athenian citizens had access to slaves. So the beginning of the economy was the practical management of resources for people who were too rich to have to do any work. By the middle of the 18th century, with the rise of the modern nation-state, it became possible to imagine what we would now call economic development. The economy started to grow larger. People started to become wealthier. Each generation could consume more than the previous one. And without giving you any evidence for this, because that would be, well, come along to Panmure House next Tuesday when I'll be talking about Adam Smith. There are still tickets, I'm told. What Adam Smith managed to see was that the wealth of nations was not the treasure, not the gold and silver which sat in state treasuries, as had been argued throughout the 17th and early 18th century. Rather, it's about people, and it's about the relationships between them. And so, in more modern language, the book, The Wealth of Nations, is a book about how best to create and sustain physical, human, social, and cultural capital. It's much more than that as well. Deirdre McCloskey, who was here last time I spent a full day in the library, very much takes the view that every economist can go back to The Wealth of Nations. From socialists through to libertarians can all go back to The Wealth of Nations and find the origins of their own way of thinking about the economy. So when I started planning to write the book, it occurred to me that one of the ways in which I should keep myself honest and actually hand in the manuscript on time would be to run a course in the history of economic thought. I'm delighted to see that I've got many students and indeed a few graduates from Heriot-Watt University here tonight, so thank you for coming along and braving the rain. My class, the year I taught it that really made the difference, only had 5 students in it. And so it was really very old-fashioned economics teaching, university as it should be, and these very intelligent young people kept me very firmly on my toes. Amongst other exercises, though, I had to set them exercises, I asked them to write a short essay on Adam Smith, prefacing their essay with a 1-sentence summary. This is a really good way for me to work out the quality of an essay without having to read all of it. That's economizing. When I read the sentence, Adam Smith was a moral philosopher who made economics possible, I was quite certain I had an A-grade essay in front of me. The sentence has made it into the book. It is true, and it's a pleasingly complete answer to the question which I had set my students. But here I think we actually start to see an important part of thinking like an economist, because to change the world, economists need to be persuasive. It's not enough to be right, we actually have to be able to persuade people. And that's one of the reasons why when we look at the very greatest exponents of economics in the 20th century, Maynard Keynes, Milton Friedman, Paul Samuelson, all of them were astonishingly eloquent. And Keynes and Friedman in particular deployed those gifts to shape economic policy for decades. Now, in writing the book, the fact that Adam Smith was a philosopher, he was able to look back on a 2,000-year long tradition of thinking about the economy from the perspective of moral philosophy, that led me to ask a quite different question. This was one of the questions I wanted to answer while I was writing. When did economics and philosophy finally separate? And if you'd asked me when I was starting, I would have said, well, it must have been John Stuart Mill, middle of the 19th century, maybe Marx, a bit later than that. But then I came across the training of Alfred Marshall, who was the dominant figure in British economics until well into the 20th century, who started his training in mathematics, planning to become an Anglican priest, but who then turned to philosophy and finally to economics, which he saw as being primarily a moral science. At Cambridge, where Marshall was a professor, economics only became a degree discipline on its own in 1902, just a little bit too late for Maynard Keynes to become a student there. And Maynard Keynes himself, his fellowship dissertation, again, Maynard Keynes also completed a maths degree first, his fellowship dissertation is on the philosophical foundations of probability theory. His examiners were Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead. Keynes, of course, later brought Wittgenstein to Cambridge. So he's someone who could work with the most serious philosophers of his time. And this is where, and then, of course, sorry, I'm going through the philosophers still. Thanks to Patrick Schotanis, I started reading large chunks of Hayek, including The Sensory Order. the work which he did in Chicago in the 1950s and early 1960s. And I began to realize that the extent to which Hayek was riffing on ideas which had been the subject of intense debate in the city during the Enlightenment. In fact, Hayek, on one occasion, asked to describe his political affiliation, described himself as a Scotch Whig. Now, there's a movement called Philosophy for Everyone, works in primary schools, and Didasco's work on financial education, for which you all had to which you all had an opportunity to contribute when you got your tickets for tonight. It's a natural extension of this library, Russell, and I would see it as being part of economics for everyone. If I'd really been planning to write a book about how to think like an economist, there would have been much more about the sort of arguments which I put into the introduction. Being an economist, I think, is an integral part of being human, certainly in the modern world. Thinking about its origins in household management, economics is about how we manage resources. Whenever we're making any resource decision, including whether to come out on a wet Wednesday evening, we're making an economic choice. Some of us are naturally better at making those decisions than others, given the circumstances which confront us, and a few people, of course, become specialists. They're so enthused by thinking about how to manage resources that they spend their entire life doing it. But I don't want to present them as some kind of priesthood who manages arcane knowledge, and I certainly don't want to suggest they're infallible. My preferred definition of an economist is someone who will be able to tell you tomorrow why the advice which they gave you yesterday about what to do today was wrong. At the moment, one of the biggest differences between economics and other sciences is thinking about climate change. Economists tend to be skeptical about the sudden popularity of planetary system models, which claim to identify boundaries, fixed limits to human activity which we dare not breach. Here I would have to say, if you're thinking about economics, forget the dismal science. Economists tend to be natural optimists, and so they struggle to imagine that there can be any rigid boundaries. In economic modelling, it's much more common to find predictions in which a mix of technological advance and carefully coordinated action will cause the behaviour of our species to change so rapidly that any minor technical breach of these planetary boundaries will not lead to catastrophic collapse. I'll leave that as something for discussion here, and I will have to admit to substantial bias, because when I read the critics of economics, it seems to me that they're attacking straw men. They have no real understanding of how economics works. But in exploring how economists think, I also have to recognise that in at least 4 times in the last 250 years, the structure of economic theory has changed substantially as the kind of problems which economists thought were important changed fundamentally. So it's entirely possible that when we're looking at climate change, I am an old-fashioned, fuddy-duddy economist who doesn't really know what's going to happen, and there are young people, possibly some of them in this room, who are going to transform the subject in the next few years and make it fit for purpose for another 100 years. So, let me move on a little bit and thinking now about, to some extent, the second half of the book. You may be aware that for the last 55 years, the Nobel Memorial Foundation has awarded a prize for economics, funded not from Alfred Nobel's original legacy, but by the Riksbank, the Swedish central bank. Now, there are people who sneer about it, claiming this is not a real Nobel Prize. But I feel that rather misses the point. Nobel had some quite strong prejudices. There's prizes for physics. There's prizes for chemistry. There's a prize for physiology and medicine. No prize for biology. There's a prize for literature. There's a prize for peace. But no prize for any of the social sciences. So think about the economics Nobel rather as you'll find economics described in my book. It recognises work about people as social animals. And that explains why economics laureates have come from political science, psychology, mathematics, and statistics, as well as, of course, economics defined very broadly. It would have been very easy for me to write a different book, simply explaining the contribution of the Nobel laureates from 1969 through to 2019, and that's an idea which I have toyed with from time to time. But I thought that would be wrong for a project in which I want to think about how economists actually have a problem considering the history of the discipline. This makes economics very different from other social scientists. If you ask most economists about Marx, their eyes will glaze over. If you ask, I would actually have to say I can understand that. Marx is extremely difficult, and his work bears almost no relationship to modern economics. But if you ask them about Smith, and I've said most economists can look back to Smith and say, oh, my work comes from there. Most of them will probably know about the pin factory example in Chapter 1, which Smith stole from Adam Ferguson, who stole it from Denis Diderot. And they'll know about the metaphor of the invisible hand, but they won't actually know that much more. Now, even a century ago, economists joked about finding someone who had read books 4 and 5 of The Wealth of Nations. There was no such man. Looked into books 4 and 5, and it's where all the really interesting stuff is. It's where Smith gets stuck into slavery. It's where Smith gets stuck into colonialism. It's where Smith thinks about what the nature of the state should be. And what I would have to say is that Smith, well, in fact, one thing, a spoiler alert, Smith, always warning you against producer lobbies, believed that there needed to be public support of education and that everyone should know philosophy. That was necessary for what he saw as a polite society. Now, if we compare economics with other social sciences, the situation is quite different. Philosophy departments still introduce students to Smith's theory of moral sentiments. Political scientists will study both of Smith's books, and they are particularly interested in understanding the unity of his thought. So what I'm going to suggest is that economists have cut themselves off from their own history, and that leads to the danger of them being inward-looking. Certainly, this is true of academic economists. The modern university, whatever it might say about wanting to support multidisciplinary work, tends to reward narrow specialists. Their work should have a clear focus on a field which is in fashion at the time. So I may be painting an especially bleak picture of economics, but it's what I know best. And I believe that economics should be much more than problem solving, much more about understanding causal relationships. An integral part of social sciences and humanities, good economics thinking should always have applications to how we build a better society. And that's what I would say that we can see with the Swedish Academy of Sciences. That's the criteria which they have been looking for when they've been rewarding people from all sorts of academic disciplines with the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences. Not science, plural sciences. We're not looking for narrowly defined excellence, but instead understanding of the economy as a whole. So that's my first 3 mistakes. Really, what is it that we're thinking about when we talk about being an economist? And I've characterized the title of the book of a mistake, the idea that the economy can be left to specialists because we're all economists, and the risk of those specialists becoming insular. I can now turn to, should we treat John Maynard Keynes as an economist? And as I was about to start writing this passage, I had a conversation with one of my very capable young colleagues, and we wondered, would Keynes be in an economics department nowadays? We both rather sadly concluded he wouldn't. There's an obvious case, of course, to be made for considering him as an economist. He was appointed as a lecturer in the subject at the University of Cambridge in 1908, and he held that post. And he became a fellow of King's College the following year, an economics fellow at King's College the following year, and held that post until his death in 1946. Between 1911 and 1945, he was the editor of the Economic Journal, published by the Royal Economic Society. And if we look at his major publications, we have a tract on monetary reform, a treatise on money, and most famously, the general theory of employment, interest, and money. It sounds pretty like economics. In a very generous obituary of Keynes, though, Paul Samuelson, discussing the general theory at some length, I'm just going to quote the most famous lines. He said, "This Keynesian system stands out indistinctly, as if the author were hardly aware of its existence or cognizant of its properties. And certainly he is at worst when expounding its relations to its predecessors." Not much good history, in other words. "Flashes of insight and intuition intersperse tedious algebra. An awkward definition suddenly gives way to an unforgettable cadenza. When it is finally mastered, we find its analysis to be obvious and at the same time new. In short, it is a work of genius." Now, that's the first piece of evidence that I have. Samuelson, probably the greatest economic theorist of the 20th century, saying that effectively claiming that Keynes was really much more a user and a critic of economic thinking. He wasn't. Was he an economist? Perhaps. Was he much more than an economist? Most definitely. Let me give you a fuller picture. Born in 1883 in Cambridge, he was the oldest of 3 children of John Neville Keynes and Florence Keynes. His father, perennial anxious man, chose to become an academic administrator at Cambridge University after a short period as an economics lecturer. Determined that his son should have the best possible opportunities, he diligently, obsessively indeed, prepared Maynard, only his mother called him John, by the way, for scholarship exams at Eton. Maynard was successful, and at Eton he excelled both academically and socially, winning a scholarship to King's College, Cambridge, and starting his studies in mathematics in 1901. A consummate networker, he became a member of the Apostles, a discussion group which was both highly camp and deeply serious. At the time, the society was enthralled to the common sense philosophy of G.E. Moore, and it was in this group that Keynes developed a strong, lifelong conviction that the good life would be found in pursuit of the good, the true, and the beautiful. That led to his belief in the importance of personal relationships, and also through friendships with Duncan Grant and Lytton Strachey, his entry into what would become the Bloomsbury Group. Though his relationship with that circle of artists lasted for years, but his aesthetic sensibility ran well beyond that. My favourite pictures of Keynes are with his wife, Lydia Lepokova. She was a ballerina, and it was for Lydia that Keynes, in the middle of the Depression, built the Cambridge Arts Theatre, funding it himself. Shortly before his death, the debts were paid off. Not only an economist, a businessman, an entrepreneur, and an impresario. That actually makes an important difference between Keynes and many of the Bloomsbury Group. They had money, he made it. And once his studies of mathematics were concluded, he stayed on at Cambridge. He attended a few economics lectures with Alfred Marshall, who had been his father's teacher, and he prepared for entry into the civil service. There, he came second in the examinations for 1906 and 1907. He joined the India office, stayed there for about 15 months, became an expert in international money, detested it, and ran back to Cambridge, where he'd prepared his fellowship dissertation. So by this stage, Maynard Keynes was simply a very clever young man. The obvious path seemed to be that he would remain at Cambridge, he would become an academic, possibly a professor, he would become an economist. He also, particularly through his mother, had very good connections with the Liberal Party. Even before the First World War, he was a guest at house parties organised by Asquith, the Prime Minister. But at the start of August 1914, war brought on a financial crisis. Keynes was recalled over the first weekend of August. His brother-in-law, to get him to London quickly enough, drove him there as a pillion passenger on his motorbike. But Keynes came to London. He played an important role in developing plans to stabilise sterling, to stabilise the exchange rate, and that in turn led, during the First World War, to a position in which he became an expert in the financing of Britain's allies. Now, Keynes, associated with the Bloomsbury Group, had strong pacifist tendencies. Yet he seemed to have no problem raising the money which would be used to allow other young men to kill themselves. But his pursuit of, if we're actually thinking about Keynes, his pursuit of the good, the true, the beautiful really ran into a roadblock when he was at the Versailles Peace Conference. Famously, recovering from flu, and Keynes had chronically bad health all through his life, he resigned from the British delegation, came back to Cambridge, and wrote the book which made him which became an international bestseller, The Economic Consequences of the Peace. Translated almost immediately into, I think it was 22 languages. It made his reputation with economists all across Europe and allowed him to start building the amazingly strong networks which he would develop between 1920 and, well, actually before the beginning of the Second World War. So I'm going to skip over most of Keynes's activities in the 1920s, except to mention that he went into investment even more. He was a rather rash speculator. He relied on his stockbrokers to help him out from time to time. And I'm going to pick up the story after the Wall Street crash. He was then in the 5th year of his first serious attempt to make a contribution to economic theory. He was writing a treatise on money. He was still politically active. He said dreadful things about Lloyd George and economic consequence of the peace. Lloyd George was now the leader of the Liberal Party, so they actually said dreadful things about each other throughout the 1920s. Lloyd George was now the leader of the Liberal Party. They buried the hatchet, and Keynes started to develop the Liberals' economic programme, which was going to involve a substantial programme of public works. But the Liberals' recovery during that general election, might wait and see if this is a story that plays out in the next few weeks, by-election gains didn't turn out into seats in Parliament. The Labour Party became the largest party, but was reliant on Liberal support to form a government. So Ramsay MacDonald became the Prime Minister. 4 months later, the Wall Street crash happened. The Great Slump, which we now know as the Great Depression, began. MacDonald decided he needed to take counsel as widely as possible. Keynes ended up on multiple committees. He argued that Britain should come off the gold standard, that Britain should devalue sterling, that interest rates should be kept low, and there should be an expansive programme of public works funded by progressive taxation. He also argued that there was, completely against the liberal tradition of the last century, that there was now a place for consideration of tariff barriers. Now, all of this meant that when Keynes tried to persuade other economists to adopt this effectively as government policy, as the recommendation for what government policy should be, he ran into real opposition from economists who were based at the LSE, particularly Lionel Robbins. Robbins' response, in fact, to Keynes's fury at his refusing to be persuaded to accept Keynes's policy proposals, was to hire Friedrich Hayek. And across 1931 and 32, Keynes and Hayek engaged in a really vicious argument. A.C. Pigou, the professor at Cambridge, described Keynes's review of Hayek's Prices and Production as being like bodyline bowling, the aggressive style of bowling which had been used by the English team in Australia the previous season, and which had led, in fact, well, actually, had more or less caused a diplomatic incident. It was taken so seriously at the time. So, by the time Hayek and Keynes had finished their argument, the Labour government had fallen. MacDonald had formed his national government with Conservative support. The Liberals had splintered and become completely ineffective. Keynes started to look much more widely. He started to think about his public role. He started to think much more about how he could be influential in the United States, where Roosevelt had just been elected and was starting to work on the New Deal. But Keynes retreated to Cambridge, and he started to think about the economy, changing the way in which we think about it by writing the general theory. The ideas he was developing seemed so strange to many of his long-standing collaborators that friendships which had lasted for 2 or 3 decades started to fray very suddenly. the response in the United States was very different. Once the book was published, postgraduate students clubbed together so that they could bulk buy the copy at trade prices and get it shipped directly from England. I think that Keynes had spotted something very interesting. Since Adam Smith, economists had tended to believe that the pursuit of self-interest would always lead to efficient outcomes. Unemployment is inefficient. 25% unemployment, as there was during the Great Depression, factories shuttered, banking systems failing, these were all signs of massive inefficiency. So in the general theory, and the reason Keynes thought that he had a general theory was he thought he could explain both the good times and the bad times. What Keynes was trying to do, I think, was to use his own area of expertise, monetary economics. By the way, monetary economics has its roots in one of the most spectacular mistakes in economics, which I know you know quite a bit about, John Law's inflation in France. So, yes, almost immediately after that, French political economists started to think, what is money? And so modern monetary economics is the result of a mistake. There you go. Right, so what we've got is that monetary economics had argued that what we would call the business cycle, what was then called credit cycles, would occur in which banks would lend too much, they would suffer bad debts, then they would need to recapitalize themselves and stop lending. It's a story which is entirely about the supply of credit. It's also a very moral story, by the way, to appeal to those of you who think economics should have links to philosophy, because it's a story in which greed runs ahead of self-interest. Now, economists also tended to believe self-interest would mean that there was infinite demand. Whatever was being produced would be being produced so it could meet some need. And that meant ultimately that productive capacity would determine the size of the economy. And the efficient use of resources would simply mean that all capacity was being used so that there would be no unemployment. Now, for economists like Robinson Hayek, what had happened during the Great Depression was that during the First World War, economies had got completely out of balance. Then during the 1920s, governments had intervened, and the purpose of their intervention was to try to bring the economy back into balance. But what they said was happening was, in fact, that had created other imbalances. Rather than making the situation better, government policy had made the situation worse. Now, effectively what they were recommending was reductions in government spending. Those policies had caused the crisis which brought down the Labour government in 1931. They would also bring down Hoover's administration, or mean that Hoover lost in a landslide to Roosevelt in the presidential election of 1932. And of course, Keynes, rather than looking for the long run, as far back as the 1923 Tract on Monetary Reform, had argued that in the long run, we're all dead. So, what he was thinking, or what I'm thinking rather, I should say, is that Keynes, arguing as a professional investor, a political advisor, a capable philosopher, was thinking primarily about the economy as a critic of economics as it was. He was thinking about the economy in a way in which no one else had up until that point. There are, as Samuelson suggested in his obituary, many places in which Keynes introduces technical novelties and doesn't really seem to know what he's doing. Thinking about the economy in a completely new way is very difficult. It's not surprising about that. But I think that what happened was, and sorry, this is not Samuelson's argument, this is Keynes's great rival Schumpeter's argument. Keynes began the process, Schumpeter argued, by thinking about policy proposals and trying to create economics which would fit them. He got it the wrong way around as far as Schumpeter was concerned. Now, there is some truth to that. Keynes did not write the general theory to address a few economists. He wanted to address the general public, but he also wanted to give good political advice. And so what we see is, in Keynes's argument, I think, what we see in the Great Depression is the weakening of the motives of need and greed. Fear had taken over the economy, and that could explain both the failure of post-war reconstruction in the 1920s and the onset of the Great Depression. In the traditional way of thinking about the economy, the challenge was always to continue building capacity. For Keynes, the challenge was to start to use capacity. And so what was happening during the Great Depression was that, fearing unemployment, workers were saving rather than spending money. Rather than trusting banks, they were withdrawing their money, causing bank runs. Investors were switching from stocks and shares into gold. What we see as well, the middle class is reducing their consumption, and fearing loan defaults, of course, banks were reducing the amount of credit which they were willing to make available. Running up huge losses, businesses had already shut factories, and many of them would remain closed for the rest of the decade. So what happened after the 1932 presidential election was that almost the entire financial system froze with fear. When March 1933, just before Roosevelt took his oath of office, the governors of New York State and Illinois had already shut the banking systems in their states. The United States was the world's great creditor. Switching off the money in those financial centres effectively meant turning off the tap of liquidity for the entire world. We had a similar situation in 2008, of course. But in Keynes's new way of thinking, the solution to these problems was obvious. Existing productive capacity was not being used. How do you use it? You have to spend money. If everyone else is afraid to spend money, who is left? Government. So government, rather like central banks or lenders of last resorts in situations of fear, in Keynes's thinking, governments become the spenders of last resort. And so what Keynes argued was they could draw on this existing capacity, they could engage in buying capital goods, engaging in physical investment, which would take on a similar role to investment by private firms. And then there's a whole load of other stuff which I could carry on, which I'm not going to go into this. I'm aware I'm actually thinking about Keynes quite seriously. I don't want to go into any more theoretical exposition. But what Keynes realized was that because there was so much saving going on, the government could borrow. The government did not have to rely. I think it's back on the. Yes. The government did not have to rely on taxation. The government, just stand there. All right. Okay. Right. Okay. The government did not have to rely on taxation. The government could borrow to fund its expenditure. And so Keynes started to see how he could rebalance the economy very simply through the process of running budget deficits. So what we have here is that in 1931 we have the Labour government refusing to support spending cuts. In 1932 we have Hoover not supporting deficit spending. Roosevelt criticised Hoover's budget deficit. Roosevelt's first budget included cuts in veterans' allowances, included cuts in all public sector salaries, so that the budget could be balanced while he was starting to run the New Deal. What he was able to do, though, was to offer people hope as the antidote to fear. And so what we have, I think, is, well, in fact, I'm going to just turn a little bit, not to talk about economics, but to talk, as I think, where economics came from. A little bit of Aristotle. Between the vices of cowardice and rashness lies the golden mean of courage. And so the general theory seems to me the essentially moral argument that public courage can overcome private fear. Keynes effectively characterised the government as I've said already, as the spender of last resort. And so what he was saying was nobody was looking to the future with confidence. The one institution who could still do that was the government. And by spending that money, by bringing fear, by banishing fear, The government would be able to encourage firms to invest more. They'd be able to encourage households to spend more. That increased spending in the economy would become income, taxable income. The government could borrow money and repay it naturally from the expansion of the economy without having to increase tax rates. So what Keynes was saying was, spending is virtuous. Saving in this situation is vice. And in that way, if you read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, that's really where the difference is between Keynes and Smith. Thank you very much.
John Law has a special place in this library for a reason that I don't think you know. We were donated a large collection of books from another institution, and we had an original 1705 John Law in there. So we sold it for £18,500. So there's a lot to be said for paper money, Robbie. There's lots, Angus Deaton says, lots of great vignettes in your book, and also lots of great quotations. And I'm going to start on a lighter note with one of those, and then we get to the meat of things. Karl Marx's mother, I suspect most people know what Karl Marx's mother said of Karl Marx, and I quote, "If only Karl had made capital instead of just writing about it." I think Frederick Engels may have had the same opinion.
Well, in fact, that's a remark which Marx made to Engels on more than one occasion because he was tapping him for money.
The other thing I didn't know was that Hayek's book was published in the Reader's Digest, or in abbreviated form was published in the Reader's Digest, so and sold exceptionally well.
Absolutely.
So there was a time when economists were popular. What happened?
Well, so what happened was we became victims of our own success. Keynes, I wanted to talk about. Keynes changed the way that we thought about the economy. If we compare what happened in 1945 to 1919, March 1945, the US Congress passes the Full Employment Act. 1948, Samuelson was writing the first edition of his textbook Economics, which went on to sell 5 million copies, I think it was. I wish I had those sales. And Samuelson wrote the first edition believing that unemployment was going to be the major problem of the US economy. By the time he came to the third edition in 1953, he was actually already starting to say, no, it's going to be inflation. So rising, we've already got full employment. Our challenge is how to manage that without going into an inflationary spiral. And so I think that one of the, I have been thinking about this because economists tend to be much more central to all sorts of public discourse than philosophers or even political scientists. And it's almost as though there's an assumption that we have practical knowledge that these other people don't. I suspect we've been riding on Keynes's coattails. Well, I suppose Keynes's coattails, and to some extent, you've mentioned Hayek, but also Friedman said, this is the counter-argument. This is what will happen if you push it too far.
And as you say, the story in this is what an economist is. And before 1906 or whatever, and the economics becomes a faculty, even after that, before that, the French had engineers studying economics. Yep. The Germans had historians. And in Austria, as you mentioned, for some reason it ended up in the law faculty. And then in the 20th century, we had Coase, who was a lawyer, Simon, who was a social scientist, von Neumann, psychologist.
Or mathematician.
And then finally...
so clever that he found people hard to understand, so not a good psychologist.
And Kahneman, who was a psychologist. So much of the progress coming from outside the discipline as well. Mm-hmm. There can't be many disciplines where that is true.
I suppose that... Well, I think that to some extent relates to what I was saying, that actually when you're thinking about the economy, we're all in the economy, we're all immersed in the economy, we all have to make economic decisions, we all have to understand it to some extent. And I think that it is, you mentioned Simon, and I was talking to someone else who said, oh, you've got Simon in the book. I know him from organisation theory. And I think that Simon is very clear that he grew up during this really wonderful time in the 1930s and 1940s. He was the head of department at the age of 25. He'd already run a huge program for the University of California. And while his training was in political science, he was able to think about decision theory in a way which went across a whole range of disciplines. So I would say it's perhaps another way, more in the last 30 or 40 years, we've started to think about discipline specifically rather than about social sciences as being something which people can go and study.
Well, let's talk about mathematics, because your book, I mean, there's a really great thread running through this as to when mathematics emerges as something economists have to really know about, how it changes things. And I wasn't aware that there'd been such a pushback against Marshall. Actually, even at his very early days, when he was just beginning, that he was bringing mathematics to bear on a discipline where it really wouldn't be very fruitful. Do you want to talk about the development of mathematics in economics?
Absolutely.
And maybe your opinions on whether it's a good thing, bad thing, whether it's gone too far. I think there are some hints in here about your opinion on that.
Okay, so I think, and here again, I went to university as an undergraduate to study mathematics. I was persuaded that after a few lectures that economics would be more interesting. And it had, all the way through my training as a student, the mathematics which I had already studied was enough to get me through. Now, I would say that there's a new principles book called Core, the Economy, which has been produced largely by academics at Oxford and University College London. And it treats the introduction to economics in a very different way. In some ways, it's the first attempt to provide a mathematically consistent approach to economics. And I used it for 3 years. And other colleagues at Heriot-Watt used it for 3 years, and perhaps some of the students who were here were exposed to it. I think it's a really interesting book, but it's not an obvious way to think about the economy. And I think that we have to be very careful about the mathematics not getting in the way of the storytelling. And so there are, you mentioned Marshall. Marshall wanted to write for the ordinary man of business. He did not want his book to be something which would be relegated just to university libraries. There's the famous line in a letter to A.L. Bowley in which he goes through, in fact, not a line, it's a paragraph in which he goes through 6 steps which he thinks is necessary for good economics. One is that you can use mathematics. You can use mathematics to extend your intuition. But once you've done that, what you actually need to do is to turn your intuition, you need to be able to explain the mathematics in good English, and then you burn the maths. Because no, that is not going to persuade anyone. There's also a line in one of Marshall's letters. If you're out cycling with Bowley, keep up a pace of 12 miles per hour. He can only think about mathematics when he's going at 8 miles an hour. But I mentioned Keynes. And it was thinking mathematically that got Keynes to go from what was becoming to be the consensus, that we needed public works, government to spend money on public works to get beyond the Depression, and Keynes to realize that actually deficit spending would get us into the situation we wanted to be. And then as soon as Keynes wrote his ideas, young economists fell on it and said, hey, we can explain, here's what Maynard's trying to say, this is how we can explain it mathematically.
I have to ask a question about Smith and bees. Mm-hmm. Now, if we go up the Royal Mile, we see a lovely statue by Sandy Stoddard of Smith, and there's a beehive. Smith didn't like bees.
Yes.
And how to think like an economist, the word that I would use that I think he uses is sympathy. Mm-hmm. Explain to people who don't associate Adam Smith with sympathy why sympathy is something that economists think about, or why that economist thought about. And have we lost that somewhere? And where is that thread in economics today?
Okay, well, sympathy is very easy because Smith gives such a wonderful example of it. Imagine, I'll use Russell as an example, imagine that David suddenly approaches Russell with a sword and cuts his arm off. Would you just sit there going, nice one? Or are you going, oh? And if you're going, oh, why are you doing it? What Smith argues is that you're not feeling empathy. You're not feeling sorry for Russell. That's a dreadful thing that's happened to you. You're feeling sympathy. You're feeling with Russell. So you actually feel the shock of the attack, perhaps almost the pain of the attack. Now, knowing David, I'm sure you'd never do anything like this, of course, but Quakers really don't do violence. No, right. What we can... So what Smith was arguing is that we are always... Where Smith takes that idea of sympathy is that we are... One of the things which motivates us is that we want the respect of others. So I definitely want your respect, Russell. I value that very much. So what that means is that I will think, what should I do putting myself into Russell's shoes so that Russell will respond sympathetically to me and approve of what I'm doing? And this is essentially how Smith starts to build his theory of a society in which people are interested in each other. And so he's able to rely on self-interest, but that self-interest is strongly related to our interest in what others will think of us. Now, there is a problem with this. This is an entirely relativist approach. Smith did not think it was. So, for example, Smith used this argument to oppose slavery very strongly. However, Smith, other people could have followed exactly the same arguments, which were saying that essentially what you have to do is to follow the standards of the time to argue for slavery. So Smith's theory has caused all sorts of problems in terms of philosophy. Where has economics lost that? Well, Marshall, when he was writing the Principles, had a picture in front of him of a poor working man, with the view that if his economics was going to be any good, it would have to address the needs of those people. Keynes, Marshall's pupil just about. By the way, Keynes is the only one of Marshall's students who, when Marshall is writing to him, doesn't go, no, you do it this way. His letters to Keynes are much more along the lines of, I'm sure you must be right. Keynes, writing the general theory, was already starting to think about progressive taxation and the importance of progressive taxation because what he wanted was a redistribution of income within society. Where have we lost it? Well, Keynes was a liberal. Most economists, I think, are naturally liberals. And I suppose that in some sense where Keynes would have said we lost it would be when we turned to social democracy rather than liberalism after the war.
Well, that's a nice, clear answer. So anyway, the good news is we're not a colony of bees.
Yes.
And I've got some bad news for you. This audience is full of economists.
Some of them I've taught.
Yeah. So who would like to ask the first question?
It makes a change to Jamie Macaulay.
So, okay. First of all, I'm an economist, so sorry about that. And I'm an economist and a theorist, one can say. So I work with math, as has been suggested. And economics models are based on math, but borrowing a bit like the expression of Ariel Rubinstein, another economist, another theorist, are fables. We tell stories through maths. So maths give us a logical way of arguing something, but at the end of the day, we tell a story. In fact, we can build model demonstrating everything we want, depends on the assumptions. So my question is that, what do you think are the differences between our stories, our fables, compared to those told by other disciplines, other species, no economists?
Not an economist, right. I thought you were wanting me to talk about bees for a second.
Well, what was the name of Mandeville's book that he so hated was called The Fable of the Bees?
Yes. So what did... So I think that what distinguishes the stories which I read from economists from those which are written by other people, and this might sound a little bit strange, but it comes absolutely back to the idea of the invisible hand. Economists like messiness. other people want the economy to be tidy. And so it seems perfectly natural to other people that we should have a command economy. Remember what I said, naturally economists argue that what we're looking for is efficiency. What could be more efficient than saying, we need this produced now? But economists believe something much more interesting. And this, by the way, is where we are like bees in many ways. Economists believe that we will pursue our own interest, doing the best we can, but in pursuing our own interest, now, there are a few things which are important here. We have to tell the truth. We have to respect property. We have to work within a system of laws. If that's the case, then the kind of exchanges which naturally take place will lead to the best possible outcome socially. So economists, I would say the difference between the kinds of stories which economists tell and the stories which other people tell is that there is no one there to manage order. That's the whole point of the invisible hand. The economy seems to be ordered as if by an invisible hand, but there isn't one. There's just people buying and selling, engaging in what Smith called truck and barter.
Any other questions or fables from the audience? David, why don't you select somebody here at the back?
Yeah, my name is Rob Schneider. If you were the Prime Minister and you had three people in front of you, one was an economist, one was an engineer, and one was a PPP graduate from a leading university, and they all give you a different story, who would you believe?
I think that's why other people are prime ministers and I'm not. I think I would be inclined to believe I mean, obviously, from what I've said personally, I would have a bias towards The Economist. But I think that what I would be inclined to believe is a story which is convincing and a story which is coherent. Because ultimately, when we're trying to understand the economy, that is the best that we can do. And so, I am going to come back to Keynes at this point here, because one of the things which I think is really important about Keynes compared with other economists before him is that all other economists effectively were saying there is only one way that the economy can be. And what Keynes was saying is, well, actually, because it's constructed socially, there are many different economies that are possible. And so, in fact, there's the story, of course, if you ask an applied economist what the time is, his answer will be, what time would you like it to be? So in economics, we actually think about, in economics, the question is, how can we actually create a story which will allow us to get from where we are now to where we want to be? But I trust the engineer to get me there much more than the economist. And the PPE graduate, well, I'm sure he can make me a cup of tea.
So remind me, the French economists come out of engineering. Are there any of those economists we still talk about today?
Oh gosh, yes.
Well,
yes,
run off some names for engineers who changed economics.
Right, Cournot, Dupuy, particularly. I mean, Samuelson in his obituary says there are 4 great books from economics: one by Smith, one by Cournot, one by Valra, and one by Keynes.
Okay,
yep.
So there we go. So engineers changed economics.
Engineers changed economics. So Valra gives us the basis of general equilibrium theory, which is the basis of all modern modelling of the whole economy. We've got the Fraser-Valander Institute at Strathclyde University was essentially founded to do that. Game theory comes from French engineering as well originally.
John, question.
So I'll just say, actually, I'm an engineer who became an actuary who became a banker, so I sort of agree with that part.
Yep.
But I'd like to just go back to what you were saying at the very beginning, and I guess for me, I feel it runs through everything that you've said, that the great economists have focused solutions for what the problem the world is facing and what society has actually created, in a sense, those problems within the economy. Whereas I think, for me, the very weak economists are the ones who take the last solutions that worked previously and just keep applying it. So the pendulum is swung. It needs a new solution. They just keep trying to push water up a hill, making the problem worse, rather than identifying, understanding what the new problem is and what needs changed. So what I'd like to ask is, given the fact that we're facing so many problems, we've got inequality, we have problems with aging populations, we have problems with resources, be that natural resources or other, you know, have you got a sense of where you think the next big step in economics will be that could address the problems we've got at the moment, rather than theories that are addressing problems that have applied in the past?
Okay. I think this ties into something which is quite popular at the moment, that GNP, gross domestic product, isn't a good measure of welfare. And sorry, there's a Keynes story here as well. In 1940, Keynes went back to the Treasury. He wanted to predict what the tax take would be if you put taxes up. Or sorry, if he advised the Chancellor to put taxes up. And he realised he didn't have good enough data. So he got hold of James Mead and Richard Stone, and basically what they did over the next couple of years was to invent national income accounting. Both of them won the Nobel Prize for Economics, Stone specifically for this work. And what that meant, you know, what we have, GDP was effectively invented as we need a measure to solve this particular problem. And what happens very often with measures that come up like this is that they start to become normalised. Now, there are good reasons for looking at GDP. We can now measure it so that we've got a pretty good estimate of what GDP was in April by now. It's much harder to measure wealth. Adam Smith didn't talk about the income of nations, he talked about the wealth of nations. And there's work which is starting to go on. There are two ways of thinking about it. One is that we actually have to think much more carefully about what the nature of capital is. And the other is, having thought about the nature of capital, we have to start completing the national accounts so they're not just about income and expenditure, but they're also about assets and liabilities. And particularly then, if we're starting to do things which cause climate change, or particularly this is work which Partha Dasgupta is associated with, work which is going to cause biodiversity loss, those potentially have huge, will have huge costs in the future, so they're charges against our capital. And so we can start to get much better measures of welfare coming from that. Now, also, when you start thinking about capital in those forms, we shouldn't be thinking just about capital as financial capital, we shouldn't be thinking about it as physical capital, we should be thinking about it as social capital, we should be thinking about it as human capital acquired through education. Health capital is extremely important. And so we should be starting to measure and natural capital, of course, as well. We should be starting to measure all of these different kinds of capital so that we can start to get better measures of the size and nature of the economy.
So on that note, on the 27th of June here, keep an eye on your inboxes, we will be discussing Bhutan's attempt to measure gross national happiness. As a Presbyterian, I will not be chairing that session. We have to stop somewhere, Robbie. You're going to be here, answer questions over drinks. Once again, if you'd like to buy the book, please speak to Lauren. We'll be able to work that out for you. But at this stage, we now all know how better to think like an economist. It's been a remarkable, cheery discussion on how to think like an economist. Robbie, thank you very much.
Thank you.